Welcome to the Jonathan Van Bilsen Show, featuring lively, in-depth conversation with compelling guests from our community. And here is our host, Jonathan Van Bilsen.
Hello and welcome to our show. Our guest today is a man who started a quest 7 years ago, and that was to visit every country on Earth without the use of an airplane. He joins us today from Hong Kong, where he's been sequestered for over a year due to the pandemic. Please welcome Thor Pedersen. Thor, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
194 countries. All I can say is I am impressed. I do get a lot of people asking me because of my travel show how many countries there are altogether, and I believe you've settled on 203, which is a combination of the United Nations states as well as a few others. So the question I guess I have to ask is why? What prompted you to start this adventure?
It's a very good question. In the very beginning, it was born out of a desire to do something which has never been done before. I was quite curious on that subject. I received an email from my father, clicked on the link, and read about people who had been to every country in the world. And I was astonished to find that no one had done it without flying. It's very hard for me to believe in a time where it feels like everything has already been done. So in the very, very beginning, it was to go out and make my claim in the world and hopefully inspire and motivate some people in the process. And then the project grew from there on out, and it became motivated by many different things along the way.
When you first set out to do this, you were in, I guess, your mid-30s. How long did you expect it would take you to finish this entire quest?
The estimate was that it would take roughly between 3.5 and 4 years, but certainly no more than 4 years, based on about a week for each country around the world. But it has proven a lot more complex.
Timing seems to never go according to plan, does it?
No.
So I'm curious, how did you plan your route? Did you sit down and map it all out to avoid crisscrossing countries? Is that what happened?
Well, in fact, I had to crisscross back and forth through a number of the same countries, but the general idea was that I would start out and do Central and Western Europe, and then I would circle up north and head across the North Atlantic to North America, and then do the Americas, including the Caribbean, come back across the Atlantic Ocean, and then get started on Africa, and then do Africa counterclockwise. And there are quite a few landlocked countries as well. So I would need to leave the coast and go far into the continent, and then come out of Africa and do eastern part of Europe, which would lead me to the Middle East. And then from the Middle East, I would already be in Asia, and then continue east through Asia and come to Southeastern Asia, and then move down to Singapore and Indonesia and into the Pacific, and save the Pacific until the end.
And now you're sequestered in Hong Kong. You've got 7 or 8 countries left to do. And I guess most of those would be in the South Pacific. Is that correct?
Yes. 9 countries left. They're all island nations and no ferries.
Good luck with that.
Thank you.
So what means of travel have you experienced? I know you have not used any airplanes whatsoever, but what type of transportation have you been on?
I aim to travel with public transportation as much as possible, and I would estimate that roughly 99% of the project has been with public transportation, such as buses and trains primarily. There have been quite a lot of ferries and taxis, motorcycle taxis, tuk-tuks, and all sorts of different ways of propelling myself forward. At this point, I feel like I've been on almost anything that floats in order to cross between continents and then go out to island nations. I've traveled on board 25 container ships.
Wow.
So this is scheduled transportation, but not quite public transportation.
I understand also you've been on a few soul sellers, and that's something you would never, ever get me involved in. Why don't you explain a little bit about what that is and how you managed to survive them?
Yeah, sure. So a soul seller is a nickname which has been given to ships, ferries, which are absolutely run down.
That is unbelievable. So you pretty much take your life into your hands. I guess they offer you pretty minimal accommodation.
They came pretty much to the end of their lifetime, and then they were sold off into someone's care. And the next time they go out into sea, it might be the last time they go out there. And therefore, if you're on board that vessel when it goes out and it sinks, your soul is for sale.
That is too funny. Well, actually, it's not. I imagine this type of traveling is not on your preferred list.
And I do not prefer traveling on board soul sellers, but sometimes on a small budget, it's the only thing you can do. And also sometimes there are simply no other options. And I know for a fact that 3 of the vessels I've traveled with, they are today at the bottom of the sea.
I guess the old adage of if it doesn't kill you, it makes you stronger applies.
Perhaps, yes.
I'm curious about some of the countries you've been to. Saudi Arabia, for example, is not big on visitors. Pakistan does not really want any tourists in there. You have to get visas for countries and that. How do you go about that, and what sort of experiences have you had?
Yeah, so in my experience, Africa was a very different continent than what I expected. And for the most part, it's really safe and super interesting countries. And it's just a small handful of countries that are conflicted to a degree where I would not advise anyone to go, certainly not now. And then perhaps another 10 countries out of 54 African countries that are hard to get to because of visa issues. But still, that leaves you with roughly 40 countries that are easy. Saudi Arabia had not been issuing tourist visas for more than 40 years when I was able to gain entrance. They do issue tourist visas now, and I don't know how easy it is to go, but it's certainly a lot easier today than it was a few years ago. And I spent about 7 months finding a way to go to Saudi Arabia and ended up entering from Dubai on a road trip to Bahrain, going through Saudi Arabia and then coming back from Bahrain to Dubai again.
Have you ever been involved in any confrontations getting into a country, issues that may have arisen, which have made you compromise your situation?
I've gone through 9 passports at this point, and quite often, if I cannot get the visa, then I spend the time that it takes to find a way to eventually get it anyway.
It sounds like at the rate you're going, some of the countries that you've been to may not exist when you finish your quest, or there might be some new ones, and you'll have to do this all over again. I could see this being a lifelong experience for you.
Oh, definitely, yes. There haven't been any new countries since 2011, and I set out from home in 2013. So fortunately, there are no new countries at this point, but there are several countries that changed their names since I went to visit them.
I'm curious, and I won't ask which country is your favorite. I do get asked that a lot as well, and my answer is simply, I just haven't been there yet.
Yeah, well, that's a good answer.
I'm curious about the financial element, the $20 a day US that you've budgeted. That must be difficult in areas such as North America, for example. I know it would probably be easy in a Vietnam, but how do you manage that?
Yeah, well, it's certainly not always easy. The $20 per day is set as an average, which means that when I do travel through more expensive countries, I can go above the average, and then hopefully it will equal out when I go through a country where the living costs are much lower. I travel with public transportation, which generally is cheap in most countries, but still you'll go through some countries where even public transportation will blow the budget. I eat a lot of local food. If it's a really expensive country, then I can find my way to the supermarket and I can buy some bread and some ham and some cheese, and I can go to a park and eat that if the temperatures are nice. I do not need a visa every day. So over time, the costs of buying a visa, they come down. And I often end up couch surfing, or I stay with a family. I meet someone, I put up my hammock if I can get away with that. I sleep on buses, I sleep in trains and so on. So I can also keep my accommodation costs down. And as a fact of matter, when I went through Canada, I slept on a bus. That was my first night my second night in Canada, I slept on a bus. And then once I reached the Canadian Red Cross in Ontario, in Ottawa, they had this gift voucher which they pulled out from a drawer and said, this is going to expire in a few days. It's for a nice hotel just up the street. Do you want this? And I went like, yes, thank you very much. You're very kind. You live up to your reputation. And I went and I stayed at a nice hotel.
When were you in Canada? Do you remember?
Yeah, that was, I do not remember which month, but it was in 2014.
Oh.
And it was the first country I reached where I could take my jacket off, and the temperatures were really pleasant, and there was green around me and so on. I'd been traveling across the North Atlantic in the winter time, so it might have been around March.
Oh, the weather's always like that here. It's usually around 35 degrees all year round and quite sunny.
Yes, sure. That's what I hear.
How long do you stay in each country? Do you have a set time, or does it depend on the situation or the country itself?
It depends greatly on the size of a country, and it depends on visas. If I have my visa and I can continue to the next country, it depends on if I've found a ship or I've made a deal or found a way to travel across the ocean to get to the next country. And these things, they generally slow me down. I'm not so much traveling as a tourist. It's a very, very set project in its own ways, with a number of things that I do and obligations to partnerships as well. I meet up with the Red Cross, I do motivational speaking, and I organize my transportation, my accommodation, my meals, and my visas as I go along. So all of that might keep me in a country if I can't get a visa, as it did when I was in Lebanon trying to get to Syria. I ended up spending some 102 days in Lebanon before that succeeded. Or as the situation is now in Hong Kong, that I've been in Hong Kong for more than 500 days due to the pandemic. But sorry, to answer the question in a more specific way, my average time has been roughly 12 days per country.
And do you plan your route well ahead of time, like your transportation, or do you wait until you get to a country and then see what's available?
Again, this is something which largely depends on the countries that are coming up ahead. So when I was traveling into Thailand, I hardly planned anything whatsoever. I'd been in touch with the Red Cross ahead of my arrival, so they knew that I was coming, and some schools and offices where I would be speaking. But in terms of accommodation and transportation, there was no need to plan for anything. It's such an easy destination. But then again, when I went to Iraq, and when I went to Syria, when I went to Afghanistan, you can bet that everything was planned and everything was very scheduled and carefully detailed.
So I'm curious, when you finally get home, will you be finished with traveling?
This is when people, they say, are you done traveling when you finish this? You've been to all the countries. I say, absolutely not. I would like to go to Galapagos. I would like to go to Alaska, Easter Island for sure. There are so many places I would like to go and see.
Thank you, Thor.
We'll continue this interesting conversation right after these messages. Hello, I'm Jonathan Van Bilsen for Photos and Travel, where we bring the world to your doorstep. During times like this, when traveling is next to impossible, a great way to see the world is through my television show, Photos and Travel, featured on the Rogers Television Network and YouTube. I've had the privilege of traveling to over 100 countries, and I've written dozens of articles about different locales and some of the experiences I've encountered. Together we'll explore the four corners of the globe. Join me as we follow elephants in Africa's Etosha Pan and walk in the history of Jerusalem. We have an entire episode dedicated to the country of Sri Lanka, formerly known as Ceylon, where we explore tea plantations and discover all kinds of wildlife. What better way than to discover the museums of Paris than from the comfort of your own living room? Or watch a Mardi Gras parade in New Orleans. And of course, one of the most memorable episodes is the city of Petra in Jordan, and walking 30,000 steps from one end to another. In one of the shows, we visit the surrounding area of London and walk among the Druids and the Kings. And of course, being Dutch, my favorite city was Amsterdam, complete with windmills, canals, and bicycles. Join me on the Rogers Network or visit YouTube and search for Jonathan Van Bilsen's Photos and Travel. I'll be your tour guide, and together we'll explore this wonderful planet we live on. Welcome back. My guest today is Thor Pedersen, a man who is on his quest. So we've talked a little bit about traveling, about how you get around from place to place. I'm curious about healthcare. What happens if you get sick? Are you able to just go to a hospital anywhere? Has that ever happened? It might be a moot point.
Yes, I have experienced health problems. I was very unfortunate to contract cerebral malaria at one point, and I got very, very sick from that, and that could have been the end of my life just within a few days if I had not been treated.
Ooh.
And when that happened, I sought out help at a local clinic. I had some help to do that.
Right.
And went to a local clinic, and they started treating me, and it wasn't really a high cost. It was maybe a few $100 US, which in the big picture isn't all that problematic. I am fairly healthy, but I'm not always in a situation where I can get really good food, depending on which countries I am in, and if I'm traveling long distances with buses and end up at bus terminals and so on. It's not always the most healthy food. My lunch today was macaroni and cheese, which definitely is not healthy, but generally I do try to eat well, and I try to take care of myself. I try to exercise. I have been relatively fortunate not to fall severely ill often, but over the course of 7.5 years, it has happened a few times.
When you travel, you must have a fair bit of gear with you. You've got clothing for 2 seasons, you've got technology, you've got cameras. How do you travel?
I travel with a North Face duffel bag, which is one big bag with that I can open up and store everything inside. And the idea with that bag is that it goes on top of the bus or underneath the bus, and then I have a small carry-on backpack where I have some of my valuables and things which I would need, snacks, nuts, and raisins, and this kind of stuff. Maybe a book and electronics. And then that's it. At the same time, I am traveling with winter clothing. I'm traveling with summer clothing, and I try to pack in a smart way, where some of these items they can double in one way or the other. I have a lot of books. I have a sleeping bag. I have a hammock. I have a mosquito net. I have a number of different electronics, and then because of that, I have so many different cables that I'm also traveling with, which also take up a lot of space. And I travel with a uniform. So I have my project logo and some of the partners on my shoulders. And I have several of the same polo shirts and the same T-shirts.
So have you ever had any safety issues anywhere in your travels?
Safety issues? Yes, there have been a few. There have been safety issues where it has been human-induced, and there have been some safety issues where it has just been the situation. I was on board a container ship where I was quite worried that we would go down in a storm. The ship was all over the place, and I was very inexperienced. Waves were crashing in over the containers, and it was quite dramatic, especially for me. But everything went well, and we continued, and we reached land. And I've been at a checkpoint with some drunken, heavily armed, uniformed men that were quite upset for no good reason other than that they didn't like my face, and waving their weapons around in a very hostile environment where I thought it could go wrong very quickly.
So Thor, I must tell you, one of the most interesting things I did read about you was that when you left on this quest 7 years ago, your fiance at the time decided to pursue her PhD while you were on your adventure. And now, 7 years later, she's actually agreed to become your wife, and you're married. Congratulations.
Yes. Yeah, so we were a couple before I left Denmark, and she's been out to visit me several times. And the 10th time she came out to visit me, I had organized a tour on top of Mount Kenya, and I got down on one knee and I asked her to marry me. And quite recently, as recent as December 2020, I was able to marry her online, because she was in Denmark and I was in Hong Kong. And this was a necessity. In order to bring her to Hong Kong, we needed to be married. So that worked out nicely.
That is amazing and wonderful. And is she able to come and visit you around the world?
Yes, she's been out to see me 23 times so far. And most recently, she came here to Hong Kong and spent about 100 days with me in Hong Kong.
Wonderful, wonderful. So let's talk a little bit about the Red Cross. You are an ambassador for them. So I assume that when you arrive in a country, the Red Cross is your first port of call. Is that correct?
Certainly. So the Red Cross is the world's largest humanitarian organization, and it came into existence in 1863, so more than 150 years ago. And today it spans across nearly every nation in the world. And it does an incredible amount of good across this planet. And it's based on the back of volunteers, and it's a neutral organization and an independent organization. So it can move basically anywhere. And I think a lot of people are aware. I think it's been very well branded. People, they know about the Red Cross, but I think too often people are not aware of the depth and the width of the activity of the Red Cross. There's so much humanitarian work that's being carried out that surprises people when I speak to them. And for me, I'm trying to raise some awareness about the different ways that the Red Cross is helping and supporting people around the world. And also I'm trying to raise some funds and invite people to come and volunteer.
So when you arrive, does the Red Cross take you under its wing and introduce you to local media, to schools, that type of thing? I understand you do a lot of motivational speaking and public speaking during your adventures in different countries.
It depends a lot. It depends on the culture. It depends on their resources. It depends on it depends on many different things. So sometimes I'm welcomed as a star, and sometimes I'm halfway ignored. Sometimes they bring me out and they introduce me to volunteers and the beneficiaries and various projects, and sometimes it's just a cup of coffee and a nice conversation. So it can be a million different things between these 189 nations that I've visited so far.
So you mentioned social media. We'll put your blog on the screen so people can visit it and start following you. It's called Once Upon a Saga, which I see the Viking roots sort of coming through there. How many followers do you have now?
Across various social media platforms, there should be a bit more than 100,000 followers, with Facebook being the largest account, followed by Instagram. And then, of course, I have the weekly blog, which entertains some people, at least.
It's very interesting to follow your adventures as you go around the world and to live vicariously through your travels. I'm sure you hear that from a lot of people. So let's talk a little bit about your funding. At $20 a day, I've done the math, that works out to about $60,000 for this adventure so far. Now, did you pay for this yourself? I assume you had a job, you had a career before you started on this quest, right?
I certainly had. I was working within shipping and logistics for 12 years prior to this project. But the general idea was that we would fund this project through sponsorships and partnerships. And we went out and met with Ross DK and GEOPS, which are both Danish companies that are experts within geothermal energy. And they decided that they would cover the budget. Then, unfortunately, they had to withdraw from the project for a few years, at which point it was a mixture between being self-funded, and then at which point I also had a number of followers online that were happy to assist. So it's been this mixture between having a corporate sponsorship, which the project enjoys again today. Ross, TK, and GEOP are on board again and have been since 2019. And then there's a Patreon account, and there are different ways that the followers, they can support if they want. And now, as you said, I'm working in Hong Kong, and that also supports it.
So let's talk a little bit about that. Hong Kong is a beautiful city. You could do a lot worse than being sequestered there, I suppose. So you arrived just prior to the pandemic. Is that true?
Yes, I arrived on the 28th of January 2020. So Wuhan was getting on the world map, but the virus hadn't spread much outside of China at the time.
So let me ask you, when you realized that you couldn't travel for an unknown length of time. Were you disheartened? Did you want to pack it in? I mean, 194 countries is pretty impressive. So nobody would fault you for calling it quits. Did that ever cross your mind?
My first thought was, where's Wuhan? And I looked up Wuhan and I saw that it was more than 1,000 kilometers away from Hong Kong. And then I almost laughed, and I was like, why are people so worried about this? This is so far away, and this is not going to affect me in any way. I couldn't imagine. I thought it was going to be a local outbreak, and I was very wrong. And then I tried to make my way out of Hong Kong, but it was already getting really hard. Hong Kong was included with mainland China and Macau and countries that were banned, and I did my best, and I didn't get anywhere. And eventually, it was declared a global pandemic. At which point, I knew and understood there was nothing I could do, and that sort of felt like relief to some degree, which doesn't sound all that nice, but it's been a very stressful project, and it's usually my problems. It's my problem to find a ship. It's my problem to get a visa. But now it felt like this is our problem, and we were all in the same boat with this. And I thought it would take a few months, and then it would sort itself out. So Hong Kong's a really, really nice place, and I imagined that I would be in Hong Kong and eat well and sleep well and prepare for the remaining 9 countries.
So what's your plan for leaving Hong Kong? Do you have any time frame in mind at all?
No, not really. I imagine I have 3 options. One is Palau, which is a small Pacific island nation, which is somewhere between Hong Kong and the Philippines. And the other 2 would be Australia and New Zealand. And Australia is a very strict country. It was a very strict country prior to the pandemic. And they're also very strict during the pandemic. And I imagine my chances are very slim in being able to get inside Australia. But I think that New Zealand might be a destination I can go to. It would take more than 3 weeks for the vessel to reach New Zealand, traveling from Hong Kong. And that could serve as sort of a safety quarantine period. And then once I arrive in New Zealand, I could quarantine again. And I'm hoping that I'll be able to reason with government in New Zealand that they would like to invite me in. But at the same time, you have all these ships that are very hesitant in taking anyone on board who doesn't need to be on board these days.
Of course. Plus, not to mention, there are thousands of ships stranded on oceans all over the world right now.
Absolutely. There are some horrible, horrible stories. One vessel has been sailing a month and a half with the captain who died, and there are no ports that are willing to take his remains.
Thor, I'm amazed at how quick our time has gone today. I want to thank you very, very much for being on our show and wish you all the best in your future travels.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
I also want to thank you, our audience, for joining us and being part of Thor's experience. Please join us next month, right here on Rogers TV.